growing up in rural Benton County, Indiana in the 1960s. I didn't give much thought to the monumental global event that had ended just 10 years before I was born. Occasionally, my brother and I might play with the white Dixie Cup sailor hat we found in a box in the basement. A few years later, we discovered a book on the shelf about aircraft carriers in World War II. See, it was my father's book. He served on such a vessel, but he didn't talk much about it. My brother and I would spend a moment or two on the pages devoted to the USS Natoma Bay, my father's ship. I remember a picture of a guy looking through a hole in the deck caused by a kamikaze. That didn't mean much to me at the time. Soon, we'd put the book down and go outside to play. In those days, my thoughts were occupied with baseball, practicing it with my cousins in the backyard, playing in Little League games, watching the Cubs on TV. But my father didn't have a lot of time for sports. He worked in construction. He came home hot and tired and frequently sullen. I just tried to stay out of his way. By the time I became a teen, he had started his own business, constructing grain bins. Here was the deal we made. I would work for him. He would pay for college for me. It was a fair deal. And my ticket out. It was hard work. We'd start by building the roof. Then lift that up with jacks my father had built. He had an engineer's mind and could figure anything out. Once raised, we'd add a ring, and so forth. The bin sheets that made up the body were made of stainless steel. They were greasy and the edges were sharp. Each sheet could weigh 50 pounds or more. My father and I would lift each sheet into place and align it with the sheet above it so the workers on the outside could shove bolts in the overlapping holes. While holding the sheet in place, we'd put nuts on the bolts. Then we'd tighten them with an impact wrench. I hated it. It was hot and humid. My fingers were cut raw by the stainless steel, and the ear-shattering clatter of impact wrenches echoing inside the steel structure rang in my ears hours after quitting time. But my father did this for a living. Day in, day out. It's ironic to me now that the deafening noise of his livelihood paralleled the deafening roar of the war he seldom talked about. It's ironic that the unforgiving steel used to build the grain bins could well have been used in a warship similar to the one that kept he and his shipmates afloat on the Pacific. Understandably, he was no picnic to work for. He was an authoritarian, quick to criticize and slow to praise. The command and control style of management he used to build those bins was a language he likely mastered on the steel deck of the USS Natoma Bay. The fall after I graduated from Benton Central High School, I headed south for Indiana University. In 4 years, I graduated from college. I moved away. Over time, he mellowed, and our relationship thawed. I didn't realize it then, but I was living out that old observation often attributed to Mark Twain. When I was a boy of 14, My father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. Time marched on. I visited often. I watched him age. When my father was well into his 90s, he received a call from Dr. Patrick Fletcher, a professor from Purdue University. Dr. Fletcher's mission was to preserve the memories of the veterans of World War II. He learned of my father's service and asked if they could talk about my dad's experiences. He recorded my father and mother in their assisted living apartment. Later, during one of my visits, my father told me about the interview. He gave me a CD. I listened to it in the rental car on the way back to the airport. But like so many of us in the middle of our careers, I had planes to catch and bills to pay. I was too busy anticipating the next day's crisis at work to really listen to the man who had survived much greater ones. My father passed away in 2015, and my mom not long after in 2017. And I've since retired. But recently, my thoughts returned to the recording. Whatever happened to it? After going through every drawer of the desk and leafing through every CD in the CD collection in the attic, I concluded I didn't have it anymore. I thought the story was lost, until I turned to the one place that remembers everything, the Library of Congress. There it was. I downloaded the recording and listened again, but this time through my perspective as a 70-year-old father. Now, really hearing these stories, in essence for the first time, I realize how much I'd missed. Here was a man born in the Great Depression, a man who wasn't allowed to finish high school, but whose engineer's mind allowed him to master the complex processes of an aircraft carrier. A man who started with nothing, but built a business and a life. A man without a high school degree who put 5 kids through college. A man who looked death in the eye, but kept loading. This is my thank you.
I was born in Benton County, Indiana, on a farm, and March the 21st, 1920. It was almost a blizzard, they told me. That day, same day was a Sunday, they took me to the Catholic Church in a wagon and horses and baptized me. I went to grade school at St. Mary's Parochial School in Dunnington, Indiana. I was there for 8 years. I went to high school at the Ambia Hickory Grove High School. I did not finish high school because my parents were very poor, living on a farm, and on my 16th birthday, my father said, "Bring your books home, son. That's all you're going to get." That's when I quit school. The parents in that depression just couldn't afford to send the kids to school. My parents just didn't have any money at all, but we had a big vegetable garden, and we butchered our own beef and pork a lot. So we had plenty to eat, but we didn't have any of the fancy stuff like even oranges or grapefruit. My parents gave me one orange for Christmas. I had two siblings that lived on the farm with us.
Originally, there were 8 children in the family during the Depression, and there were 3 sons and 5 daughters.
I was tired of farming for my father. He was an old German, and he was very strict. In fact, he run my oldest brother off. My oldest brother ran away, and we didn't hear from him for 2 years. He was pretty crabby, my father. Well, I set him down when I was 18 and told him my brother Joe left, and if you don't treat me better, I'm going to leave too. That kind of helped a little. Well, we knew that there was problems. See, I was 21 when that happened, and I suppose the day it happened, I was engaged to Dolores, and we were out riding around. I was trying to find a boxer puppy. So I did find out about it over the car radio the same day that it happened.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. We take you now to Washington.
The details are not available. They will be in a few minutes. The White House is now giving out a statement. A Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor naturally would mean war. And hostilities of this kind would naturally mean that the President would ask Congress for a declaration of war.
See, my brother wasn't home, and I had a draft number, but as long as I was helping my parents, the only one helping them, they didn't take me. But when my brother showed up, the older brother, then I was ready for the draft, so I enlisted in the Navy. I went to Great Lakes Naval Station, and from there, I think we had 8 weeks training. I came home for vacation, I think a week, wasn't it? And then they shipped me to California and put me on a seaplane base because the ship I was going to get on wasn't built yet. And I waited on that seaplane base. It wasn't very long, and the ship was finished building then. It was an aircraft carrier, a CVE aircraft carrier, and the name of it was Natoma Bay. I understood Natoma Bay was a bay in Alaska. A lot of the ships were named after bay. I know that 3 of them sailing in our convoy was Manila Bay, and Omni Bay, and Pitcairn Bay. We headed for Pearl Harbor. So we picked up supplies at Pearl Harbor. and then we went on out further into the Pacific. We wasn't even out in the war zone and a Japanese plane attacked us. But he didn't hit us. Wasn't a kamikaze, I don't think. But we were taking on fuel from a tanker. The tanker cut the hose off in the middle of the process. It might have been a Betty or a Tony or a Zero. Probably was a Zero. Excited, scared. I went on the boat as a seaman, and after about 8 months, they gave me a rate of coxswain. I worked hard on that ship because I was a farm boy and knew how to work. And before very long then, they gave me a rate of third-class boatswain mate. And my duties was, I was in charge of about 40 men in the 2nd Division. And one of the duties I had was handling supplies and things off of a supply ship while we were underway. I was in charge of that. We had to put about a 3-inch manila over to the other ship, and then with a pulley on it, and they would load our cargo net with ships, and then I was responsible for handling the caps and that kept the manila tight. I don't call it a rope. And then I would in charge of taking on 500-pound bonds the same way underway. But the worst one that bothered me most was sending a man over to the other ship, especially if he was in a stretcher. That was about the worst. I was scared that I would drop him in the sea. If it was just a man, you would put him in a boatswain chair and send him back and forth. And that wasn't so bad. And if the flyers went down and were all right, a destroyer normally picked them up. And then the destroyer would come along our starboard side. And then we would take him from the destroyer over to our ship so he could fly again. It was kind of tricky. They had to, of course, have the same speed and stay right alongside of you, and they were at least 50 feet away.
They had to paint the ship in motion, and he had to assign those young fellows to go out and do that, and he said they almost cried. They were so frightened.
Well, they had a plank on a rope on each end, and they had to lower and raise that plank themselves while sitting out there in the open. I hated to do that to them, but that had to be done.
For a boy from rural Indiana, you'd think the Navy would offer a world of new flavors.
Ice cream, that was a joke. They had an ice cream shop on there, but in 5 minutes they sold out.
But my father joked that no matter where they were in the Philippine Sea, the one thing you could count on was the beans.
A lot of beans. I like beans. You could go through the galley any time of the day, and they had a pot almost as big as this table. You could dip in the beans. The rest of the food was bad, and I still like beans.
They were always there. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The USS Natoma Bay was a formidable war machine, but she ran on a never-ending supply of Navy beans.
Tokyo Rose told us we were sunk 3 times. Well, she was from the United States. I didn't have much time to listen.
He was saying that some of the boys that got put on that ship of his, they come on the boat singing, "Mersey don't."
We thought he was crazy. Send him back to the States. Little lambsy divey.
Mersey dotes and dozy dotes and little lambsy divey, a kiddly divey do wouldn't do. Mersey dotes and dozy dotes and little lambsy divey, a kiddly divey.
We thought he was off of his rocker. You know how they stopped the planes on them? They had cables up about that high off of the deck, and then them planes had a tail hook which was about 6 feet long or 8, and that tail hook was supposed to catch one of them cables. Boy, it stopped it. Them pilots had a hard time. And then most planes actually didn't fly off of the ship themselves. They were put on a hydraulic ram that was probably 70 feet long, and they were hooked up to that hydraulic, and when that shot them off of the ship, they were going 100 miles an hour in 70 feet.
By the fall of 1944, after the Battle of Midway, the Allies had gained the upper hand and were preparing for the invasion of Japan. As a defensive move, Japan had fortified the many islands surrounding the country and the Philippines. U.S. naval forces under the command of Admiral William Halsey were providing crucial air cover for the invasion and landings on Leyte. The U.S. naval forces included the U.S. Third Fleet and the U.S. Seventh Fleet. The Seventh Fleet included the Natoma Bay, the flagship of Taffy II. The Navy left Saipan and sailed for Samar Island in Leyte Gulf. But the Japanese set a trap. Their strategy was a massive last-ditch attempt to destroy the U.S. invasion fleet supporting the Marine landings at Leyte. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Northern Force, was ordered to sail south from Japan to act as a decoy. The goal was to draw Admiral Halsey's powerful U.S. Third Fleet, the main offensive striking arm with its fast fleet carriers, away from Leyte. Halsey fell for the decoy, leaving the U.S. forces divided. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, consisting of landing ships, older battleships, and escort carriers, including the Natoma Bay, was left behind to continue to support the landing operation in Leyte. Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, and specifically the 3 small, lightly protected escort carrier groups, were left exposed. On paper, the Seventh Fleet was no match for the remaining Japanese forces. They converged to attack the vulnerable U.S. landing ships and escort carriers near the beachhead. On the deck of the Natoma Bay, the morning routine ended with a scream over the radio. To our north, Taffy III had just bumped into the main Japanese battle fleet. The message was unthinkable. Enemy battleships in sight. We are under fire. As the flagship of Taffy II, the Natoma Bay didn't turn away. Rear Admiral Felix Stump gave the order that would save the invasion. Launch everything. deck became a scene of controlled madness. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and the deafening roar of 2,000 horsepower radial engines.
Of course, our planes were loading and taking off and bombing them, and we were, they had those aircraft carriers pouring all the diesel fuel in them they could, and they was smoking and they were trying to get out of the way.
Ordnance crews worked like men possessed, winching 500-pound bombs and torpedoes onto planes while the engines were already hot. Pilots didn't wait for a full squadron. They launched in pairs, in singles, whatever was ready. Over the next few hours, the Natoma Bay was a factory of air power. 16 Avengers and 8 Wildcats from the Natoma Bay alone clawed into the sky. They didn't just fly. They dived into a wall of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, dropping torpedoes and then circling back to make dry runs, scaring the Japanese captains into turning their massive ships just to avoid an attack from a plane that had already run out of ammunition. While the CVEs were launching air attacks, they were under bombardment from the Japanese ships.
These three Japanese, I believe there was 3 Japanese battle wagons coming out of Subic Bay, and they were the ones that was firing at us. And the only shell that I saw was the one that was on our starboard side that was about 50 feet in the water away from us. Yeah, if that would have hit us, that would have been the end.
How big was the geyser in that when it went off?
Oh, I'd say it was up 50 feet, 40 or 50 feet. And then we had the prettiest rainbow.
They were the cavalry. While the destroyers to the north were being torn apart, the planes from the Natoma Bay were the sting that finally made the Japanese admiral believe that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. They bought the time. They saved the beachhead. And they did it one frantic takeoff at a time. By December 1944, the Natoma Bay had survived the biggest naval battle in history at Leyte Gulf. There, Admiral Kincaid and Rear Admiral Stump had pulled off the ultimate tactical gamble. They had outmaneuvered the world's largest battleships with little more than smoke screens and raw nerves. But the Natoma Bay and her crew were about to meet an enemy that couldn't be bluffed. Nature doesn't fall for a sleight of hand, and it doesn't care about the bravery of a crew. General MacArthur was moving on to Mindoro, and Admiral Bull Halsey's Third Fleet was the shield. But the fleet was running on fumes. The destroyers were low on fuel, riding high and unstable in the water. Halsey, ever the aggressor, was determined to refuel and stay in the fight. He ignored the falling barometers and the warnings of a small tropical disturbance. It wasn't small. It was a typhoon named Cobra. And because of Halsey's refusal to retreat, the fleet sailed directly into its throat.
You don't believe that. Typhoon, they called it a typhoon. We spent 3 days in the eye of that thing.
They called it Halsey's Typhoon.
Well, we weren't the only convoy that was in it, I know that. So that's why they called it his. I don't know why he done that or why that couldn't have been prevented. They surely knew it was coming. But it was awful. That's one time I said my prayers, Hail Mary, this ship is going to break up.
This wasn't just a storm, it was a massacre. On the Natoma Bay, the world turned sideways. The ship began to roll 30, 35, nearly 40 degrees. At that angle, you aren't walking on floors, you're crawling on walls.
I don't know the exact degrees, but the flight deck was 60 feet off of the water, and we were taking water over the flight deck.
Below decks, the controlled madness of the flight deck was replaced by a different kind of chaos, a sickening mix of high-octane fuel and the relentless stench of 1,000 seasick men.
3 days, the toilets ran over. There was vomit all over the ship.
It was a test of the soul, where the only thing louder than the wind was the sound of steel cables snapping on the hangar deck as planes broke loose, becoming 10,000-pound wrecking balls.
Rolling enough that the planes were lashed down to the deck. Airplane cables, might have been 3/8 inch cables, and 2 or 3 of them broke the cable and rolled off, damaged the gun mounts.
When the sun finally broke through the clouds on December 19th, the Pacific didn't look like a battlefield. There were no oil slicks, no burning hulks, no enemy to point to. There was only the swell of the water and a terrible, empty horizon. Bull Halsey had led them into the mouth of the Cobra, and the cost was written in names that would never come home. 793 sailors, men who had survived the kamikazes of Leyte and the guns of the Japanese Empire, were swallowed by the sea in a single day. 3 destroyers had simply vanished, rolled over by 70-foot waves and pulled into the deep. The Natoma Bay was still afloat, but she was scarred. Her flight deck was a graveyard of twisted metal and snapped cables. As the crew began the grim work of cleaning up the wreckage and the vomit, there was no cheering, no sense of victory. They had learned a cold, hard truth. In the Pacific, the Japanese were an enemy you could fight. But the ocean? The ocean was a god you could only hope to survive. For the sailor on the Natoma Bay, the war was no longer just about the mission. It was about the man standing next to him and the fragile tin can that kept them both above the abyss.
A few weeks later, the survivors of Halsey's typhoon were deep in the volatile Sulu Sea, navigating narrow corridors between Japanese-held islands. They were weeks away from the massive invasion of Luzon. The entire formation, including the USS Natoma Bay and her 900 men, were traveling in the dark, using complete radar and radio silence to shield themselves from an enemy they knew was close. But at 5:12 p.m. on January 4th, that silence was shattered forever. A lone kamikaze, diving at maximum velocity and out of the blind afternoon sun, slammed into the flight deck of the USS Omni Bay, a sister ship in the convoy to the Natoma Bay. It didn't strike the Natoma Bay, but every man aboard her felt the impact.
The Omni Bay was sunk in front of us.
The Omni Bay was fully loaded with planes full of gasoline and bombs on her hangar deck. She didn't just burn, she melted. As night fell, she became a giant, howling beacon. From the deck of the Natoma Bay, it was a terrifying sight. She was illuminating the whole fleet, turning 90 ships into easy, glowing targets.
She got hit and caught on fire, and it was in the nighttime, and that blaze was something else to see, and it was so bright that they didn't want the Japanese to see it.
The fires could not be contained, and the risk to the task group was too great. Admiral Jesse Ollendorf had no choice. He ordered the nearby destroyer, the USS Burns, to end her suffering. The crew of the Burns fired a single necessary torpedo into their own burning sister ship.
So they torpedoed it and sank it. A destroyer put a torpedo in it.
"800 sailors were plucked from the sea by destroyers in the area, but 95 lost their lives that night. "15 hours after seeing the Omni Bay sink, my father stared his own fate in the eyes. That morning of January 5th, the rules of naval warfare had changed. The Japanese Navy was shattered, their fuel was gone, and their ammunition was low. In their desperation, they turned their aircraft into their final weapons. This was no longer a battle of skill against skill. It was a battle against an enemy that had already decided to die. As the Natoma Bay pushed into the South China Sea, the horizon was a constant line of black smoke. The war diary for that afternoon reads like a frantic roll call of disaster. At 17:15, the cruiser Louisville was hit. Minutes later, the Australian destroyer Arunta was struck in the stern. At 17:48, the carrier Manila Bay was hit, twice. One plane screaming through the flight deck into the radar spaces, another exploding against the bridge in a sheet of flame. From his gun tub on the aft quarter, my father watched as ship after ship in the formation was engulfed in fire, and plane after plane screamed off to engage the Japanese attack.
Our planes, see, them planes took off by the dozens and hit those battleships. Then they would come back and get reloaded and take off again. We lost some planes in that. I don't know whether it was 3 or 4, I believe.
Before the big guns, there was the 20 millimeter. It was a lonely, terrifying post. They strapped you into the harness, locking you to the weapon. You didn't just fire the gun, you wore it. You stayed there until they let you out.
the first they put me on a 20 millimeter. That was a one-man gun. They strapped you in that. You didn't get out till they unstrapped you.
At this point, it wasn't a question of if the kamikazes would find the Natoma Bay. It was only a question of when. The Manila Bay was still burning when, just 60 seconds later, the Natoma Bay radar picked up a new bogey. Another kamikaze, flying a Zeke, selected this ship as a target.
And they transferred me over to a 40 miller on the aft starboard quarter. I was on a 40 millimeter gun. That's what shot down that kamikaze.
The Japanese Zeke appeared on the horizon. He wasn't looking for a dogfight. He was looking for a deck. He circled the ship, looking for the softest entry point to the flight deck. He crossed from the port side, swung wide around the stern, and then leveled off. Soon, he was no longer a speck on the horizon. He was a roar of an engine and a blur of metal, lining up for a death run along the flight deck. My father, at the 40 millimeter mount, fed shells into the gun as fast as the mechanism would take them. In that second, the distance between life and death vanished.
The only one that we shot down close was the one that my gun took out. He was over to the port side, and they had pictures of him, and he came around behind the ship and over to the starboard side quite a ways out. And then he leveled off and came right straight at the flight deck at that level, because a plane coming in that low is hard to hit. You can't get the guns down.
In an interview years later, my father finally spoke about those few seconds of life and death. He told the reporter, who was doing a story on his shipmate and friend Bill Bonfa, that as the Zeke bore down on them, he looked the pilot in the eye and realized this was it. Looked him in the eye and said, "Well, that's my Hail Mary. I'm a goner." But Kirsch kept loading a 40 millimeter gun. It seemed to me like he exploded right in front of us, Kirsch said.
We were firing at him full blast, but when he got that close to us that I could see him sitting in the plane, why, that was pretty close. I would load, but the next thing he disappeared, and then we heard or felt a bump in the ship.
He didn't just see a plane. He looked through the cockpit glass and saw the man who was coming to kill him. And in his head, he said his goodbye. He kept loading because that's what he was trained to do. And that training saved the ship. The 40 millimeter shells tore into the Zeke's left wing, shearing it off. The plane didn't hit the deck. It exploded in the wake, so close, the shock wave knocked Bill Baumfalk off his platform, and pieces of the shattered fuselage sprinkled the fantail. The Natoma Bay was an escort carrier, small, vulnerable, and just over 500 feet long. To a kamikaze pilot, she was a tiny target in a vast ocean. But a few months later, the Natoma Bay's luck finally hit a snag. Another suicide pilot came almost straight down, slamming into the flight deck. My father was below deck when the impact shook the hull.
The way they told it, I wasn't up there on the deck, but the way they told it, he came almost straight down. And if he'd have been 20 feet further, he would have missed the ship. See, that ship was only 512 feet long, the flight deck.
The hit could have ended the war for the Natoma Bay. It could have sent the ship limping back to Pearl Harbor, or worse. But the Natoma Bay didn't have time for a retreat. While the smoke was still clearing, the repair crews were already on the deck with hammers and saws and timber.
And you know, that happened at 7 o'clock in the morning, and at 11 o'clock, them guys had that whole patch. And we were taking off planes again at 11 o'clock.
"4 hours. That's all it took to defy the enemy's best shot. It was this relentless spirit, from the gunners on the aft quarter to the carpenters on the flight deck, that made the Natoma Bay the only ship of her kind to get hit and never leave the line." By September, the math of the atomic age had done its work. But for the men at sea, the war didn't truly end until they heard a voice crackling over the ship's radio, a broadcast traveling across the water from Tokyo Bay.
I think they announced that over the ship, yes, that MacArthur was on the Missouri. Ship Missouri went to Japan, Tokyo.
As General MacArthur accepted the surrender on the deck of the Missouri, the news rippled through the fleet. On the Natoma Bay, the guns finally went silent. For my father, the war wasn't a 3-year chapter in a history book. It was exactly 1,063 days. It began on a Tuesday in October 1942 when he walked into a recruitment office. And it didn't truly end until he heard that radio broadcast from the deck of the Missouri. 1,063 days of waiting, working, and when the time came, loading.
Pretty proud to be on a ship that was the most decorated and traveled the most nautical miles.
The war ended, leaving behind the burning gasoline and the shattered debris of the Pacific. The ship was saved, but the jolt of these attacks lasted a lifetime. For Bill Baumfalk, it was a physical weight, a back injury from the blast that he would carry for 60 years. For my father, the weight was quieter. He returned home to Benton County, built a life, and raised a family.
I come home and tried to farm. My parents moved off of the farm for so that we could live there. 17 years, I think. We had 5 children, and I said, we just aren't going to make it. We're just hardly able to pay the taxes. I started my own company then, and I worked building farm buildings and grain bins. It was very lucrative.
We were able to put all the children through college.
And I've done my own. We owned the farm. We owned 160 acres. It was paid for when I was 50 years old. We've been together 66 and a half years. Yesterday I went to the VA and I got some flowers for her. Mother's Day.
On a cold, quiet Indiana morning, in the cemetery across the road from where 95 years earlier he'd been baptized, my father could finally rest. "21 shots rang out, piercing the stillness, echoing off of the grain bins we'd built, and proclaiming for all to hear his service. He never forgot the Hail Marys, he said, being tossed like a rag doll in Halsey's Typhoon or in the shadow of the 40-millimeter gun. He never forgot the Pacific swallowing the burning hulk of his sister ship, or when he locked eyes with a Japanese kamikaze intent on killing him. He was barely a boy then, doing what he was trained to do. And because he kept loading, the rest of our story was made possible.